For those who are joining us for the first time today, the National Association of Regulatory Utility Commissioners, NARUC, is the nonprofit organization that represents state utility regulatory commissions in all 50 states and the U.S. territories. NARUC members regulate electricity, natural gas, telecommunications, and water utilities across the country. Next slide. This webinar is hosted by NARUC Center for Partnerships and Innovation, and I am the director of the center. My name is Danielle Sass-Burnett. We are happy to have you all here. The Center for Partnerships and Innovation is a grant-funded team that's focused on providing technical assistance to NARUC's members across the country, both commissioners and commission staff. We identify emerging challenges and help connect commissions with expertise and strategies that support their complex decision-making. We do this by building relationships, developing resources, and delivering trainings. The webinar that you are viewing today is part of a monthly innovation webinar series, and we will provide information about the rest of the series for the year at the end. As I mentioned previously, today's webinar is being recorded and will be posted on NARUC's website, and we'll drop the link for that into the chat. Next slide. So as I noted, today's webinar is on considering non-energy benefits in commission decision-making, what counts. Very pleased to be able to bring you moderator Commissioner Cecile Fraser from the Massachusetts Department of Public Utilities, who will introduce our panelists today and lead our question and answer sessions. You are welcome to type any questions into the chat at any point in time or use the Q&A function. Commissioner Fraser, please take it away.
Thank you, Danielle, and good afternoon, everybody. Delighted to moderate this panel on considering non-energy benefits in PUC decision-making, what counts. As Danielle stated, I am Cecile Fraser, a commissioner with the Massachusetts Department of Public Utilities, and nothing I say during this webinar represents the views of the Mass DPU. We have a terrific panel today to help us think through issues of cost-benefit analysis and non-energy benefits in the context of renewables, energy efficiency, DER programs that are all designed to meet a variety of state goals. First, we have Steve Schiller, a senior advisor affiliate with the Electricity Markets and Policy Department of the Lawrence Berkeley National Labs. Steve will be followed by Julie Michaels, the Director of Clean Energy Valuation for E for the Future, where she focuses on developing economic guidance on cost-effectiveness assessment of distributed energy resources. Followed by Julie, we'll have Mark Warner, a Vice President at Gable Associates, where he focuses on developing market-leading clean energy policies and supporting clients implementing advanced energy projects. So I'll turn it over to Steve. Steve?
Thank you, Commissioner. And I'm going to get my screen sharing going here. And hi, everybody. It's great to have this opportunity to be with you all here. And I want to certainly thank NARUC for these innovation webinars, particularly the staff, Jessica Diaz and Daniel Burnett, and of course our moderator, Commissioner Fraser. So before I kick into my brief presentation, just want to mention that the U.S. Department of Energy, as some of you have taken advantage of before, provides free, unbiased, independent technical assistance to commissions around the country. Work on everything from grid modernization to renewables integration, integrated resource planning, efficiency, renewables, you name it, provide technical assistance. And if commissioners, commission staff are interested, you can reach out to the people listed on this slide. As Danielle mentioned, these slides will be shared, or you can just reach out to me and I can help you connect with this service that's provided by the Department of Energy through the national labs. So I'm going to cover sort of the introduction to all this with defining the non-energy impacts, and I do call them NEIs because they could be positive or negative. although as I'll talk about, they're mostly positive, and I'll get into the categories and why regulators should care about this and a little bit about determining these values. But first, let me start off with a little bit of context. What we're talking about are the impacts that come from distributed energy resources, or DERs. To me, I see regulators as working to support programs that align with their jurisdiction's policies, your goals, your regulations, and the ones that are cost effective. So we have various ways to determine if a program or investments by your regulated utility are cost effective, but they all come down to comparing the impacts or the costs and benefits of various options to meet these policy goals. And traditionally, we define these into three categories or groupings of cost and benefits. There's the utility system impacts, such as avoided generation, transmission, GT&D costs. There's the participant impacts, sometimes called the host utility customer impacts. And those might include the impacts, the costs that the customer has to pay themselves to get the DER. And then there's a broad category of societal impacts, such as public health benefits from pollution reduction, or perhaps addressing equity issues. So let's get to defining these things, these NEIs. So what they are is a wide range of costs and benefits that are not clearly associated with energy GT&D. These can be the cost, all the costs beyond those associated with directly implementing an energy program. And again, those can be utility, participant, or societal costs. And similarly, the benefits, all those utility system, participant, societal benefits beyond those directly associated with the utility providing the GT&D. In practice, definitions of specific NEIs vary, and there's some potential for overlap between energy and non-energy impacts. But what's really important is not necessarily getting them all into the right bucket, but concerning all the substantive, impacts, as long as they're connected to your jurisdiction's policies or regulations or goals, and that they're substantive and relevant to the cost-effective analysis. Before I get into some examples, let me just mention a couple resources, one of which is a report from the Berkeley lab that looked at 30 different states' ways of calculating NEIs and talks about how you can apply one state's NEI calculations and analysis and values into your own jurisdiction. And it also lists quite a few other references. It's a good resource document. And Julie Michaels, who's talking next, is going to talk about another resource in her program. So here is a first page of two listing some NEI categories. And these, again, are the important considerations that you might want to be looking at for your cost benefit analysis. The way this is organized is that the table has from top to bottom the most commonly used ones that we found in the 30 states that we looked at. And the second column is obviously the title and whether they're a participant or utility or societal impact, and then the definition. Given the time, I'm not going to go through all these, but a couple examples are, concerning the water and other fuels impacts, say natural gas. If your program you're looking at is electricity, this can be a really big impact for the host customers. Another category is health and safety benefits from the consumer point of view. And of course, for the utility, there can be, impacts as well, such as energy price suppression that comes from reducing consumption. Now, here's the second page of ones. And again, I'm not going to go through all these, but maybe just some examples, maybe some societal ones. The economic development is an option that's talked a lot about with DERs. Again, incremental jobs, not just the total jobs, but incremental jobs that might be associated with these programs. And then a big one, public health benefits of reduced water and air pollution. And another one might be just the generalized category of security impacts, which I think today for most of us looks at reliability and resilience and what those benefits can be for society or the utility or individuals. So that's kind of interesting, great, but why do I care? Why do you care as a regulator? Do these NEIs really matter as compared to the actual direct energy benefits? And the answer is yes. NEIs can be positive or negative, as I mentioned before, but what we find is that for DERs, they're mostly positive. Now that value can vary, it does vary, depending on jurisdiction and the situation, And they can frankly vary from pretty much meaningless to really substantial. So substantial that they can move the needle and push more programs into that cost-effective category. For example, our work at the Berkeley lab has shown that nationally, on average, it costs about 2.5 cents to do energy efficiency. And when looking at NEIs, what we found is monetary value, things such as public health benefits or improved reliability, being about 40%, a penny per kilowatt hour. So, when you include things like that, if your DER program supports your state's policy goals, but it's maybe not quite cost effective, just considering the energy only impacts. If you look at these non-energy impacts that are consistent with your policies and regulations, you might be able to get more of these resources in because they are cost effective when you look at all the different options. So following up, from that point, this slide just, really says, including the NEIs and the cost benefit analysis is not only a good practice, it might be required by your policies or your regulations, and it can help you integrate, across all types of energy resources when you start looking at all various costs and benefits, both energy and non-energy, of these various resource options that you have as the regulators. And if you're going to look at these, you just want to make sure that if there's a relevant and substantive NEI that you take it into consideration. Last little point here, aside from the regulators, the value of the NEIs is that they're really important in program design and marketing. What we find is that for DERs, particularly efficiency, there's a lot of benefits that consumers look at beyond the energy savings, and that might be what drives them. So it's important to understand these non-energy impacts when designing your programs and trying to get consumers to increase their uptake. So getting into now, how do you actually determine these? A lot of concerns we do hear is that they're hard to quantify and to monetize for use in benefit cost analysis. And while some are easy to figure out, there are some that are difficult. For that reason, regulators across the country have developed two broad approaches of either applying quantitative values for these NEIs in the cost benefit analysis, or when not possible, just using some qualitative considerations. And I'll talk about that a bit here. And again, all these, they're estimates, they're approximations, just like when we predict the future price of natural gas. But the bottom line is better to use the best available approximation for a material impact than to assume it just doesn't exist or its value is zero. Because remember, if you assume that NEI has a zero value, you're basically making a decision. You're making an assumption about what its value is, and you're assuming it's zero. So if you don't, look at these when they are relevant, you're perhaps, having an error of omission, versus the one people mostly worry about, errors of commission. But we don't want to have either one, because either one of those can lead to the unintended consequences, the nightmare of all regulators. So let's get to the next slide here. Whoops, that slide, here we go. So in the National Standard Practice Manual, which actually Julie is going to talk about more, there's 4 methods that were mentioned for determining DER values. The best is to do your own jurisdiction-specific studies. They're the most rigorous or reliable. They use the data from your own area. They can, be, time-consuming and expensive. So the next option is to look at studies from other jurisdictions. That Berkeley lab report I mentioned before, as I said, that's a big focus of that report and how to use that. Of course, you have to take care that you're applying them appropriately and take into consideration any local conditions, such as local labor rates if you're applying from a different state. These other areas I'm going to mention a little bit quickly in these next 2 slides. The idea of using benchmarks, and the idea of the alternative benchmark is to allow the DERs to be considered cost effective at a predetermined benefit cost ratio that's different than 1.0. So a regulator can apply a benefit cost ratio of greater than 1 to account for DER costs that haven't been monetized, or a benefit cost ratio of less than 1 to account for benefits that haven't been monetized. Next is proxies. For the purpose of the benefit cost analysis, the proxy is pretty, simple quantitative value that's added onto other impacts that you have monetized. They're typically based on professional judgment, but of course they shouldn't be perceived as arbitrary values but they are quite common. A lot of states use them. The last I looked, Colorado and Idaho apply a 10% adder to energy cost savings as a proxy to take into account NEIs. And then there's the qualitative values approach, as I mentioned in the list of 5. You know, if your policies and goals say you should be considering an impact, but you're unable to quantify it, monetize it, then a secondary option, a 5th option, I guess, in this case, is to just sort of basically qualitatively account for it. And when you're doing your analysis of a decision to make an investment, to approve a program or not, you have these qualitative factors that you might take into consideration, such as, say, market transformation, benefits. And this slide goes through, some various, ways to do that. But for time considerations, I'm not going to go through that, but simply just sort of come back to my summary here and say, what NEIs are. Those are the impacts that are not directly associated with the GT&D. They can be rather difficult to quantify, but there really are a lot of ways to come up with these and methods for determining these values, which the resources I've mentioned that are available through the webinar you can look at. On balance, we found them to be positive, that they can help, show that investments are more cost effective than you perhaps would have thought just looking at the energy benefits. It's important to consider them, if they're substantive and meaningful. And, it's always better to have a value than just assume 0 because, well, 0 is a value. So with that, thank you. And I'll turn it back to our moderator, Commissioner Fraser.
Thank you very much, Steve. That was a very helpful foundation and context setting. We do have a question from the audience. Just bear with me. Could you talk a bit more about cost effectiveness, please, in the context of the NEIs?
So for NEIs are either benefits or costs, and so they would go into that cost benefit analysis as an additional benefit or additional cost to be considered. So if you have $1 million of benefits associated with your energy efficiency program and $1.2 million of cost, just looking at the energy benefits and costs, you would think, well, that's not necessarily a good cost effective. But say it's important per the state's policies established by your legislature or your, executive action or the commission itself says that we want to look at public health benefits. Well, it could turn out that those public health benefits are worth another $500,000, just making up numbers. So when you add that benefit into the energy benefits, you get $1.5 million of benefits compared to that, $1.2 million cost. And therefore it becomes cost effective considering all of the policies and requirements associated with the commission's considerations. And deciding which impacts go into your cost benefit analysis is part of the process of defining the cost benefit analysis. And the National Standard Practice Manual that I mentioned, and again, Julie's going to talk about, it was a handbook that was prepared to provide, again, an unbiased, independent perspective about how commissions can design their cost benefit analysis that takes into consideration their policies and considerations within their own state. So you can have a jurisdiction specific cost benefit analysis. So that's kind of a quick rundown. Hopefully that answers at least part of the question there.
My apologies, my mouse has a mind of its own. Thank you very much, Steve. And we'll turn it over to Julie if we have no other questions at this point.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for this opportunity to speak with you here this afternoon and appreciate the introductions. And thank you, Steve, for setting the table so nicely for me for my presentation here. So I think I don't need to say too much about the National Energy Screening Project. Hopefully many of you are familiar with the work of the NESP, including its publications of the Nspm for EE and more recently for distributed energy resources. Another resource that the NESP manages is this database of screening practices, and I'll be touching on some of the data in that resource with you today. NESP's work is managed by E4the-Future. We coordinate with state partners around the country, and our work is funded primarily by E4the-Future and US DOE. So I'm putting up here the set of NSPM core foundational principles. And hopefully, again, many of you are familiar with these principles. They serve as a way for jurisdictions to guide the development of primary cost effectiveness testing. And I highlight a few here, and I really don't need to go over many of them because Steve did cover some of these in his slide deck. The important thing is that these principles can help inform jurisdictions as they determine what NEIs to account for and how to account for them to ensure economic sound analysis in their benefit cost testing efforts. And a few things here that I'm going to touch on as we go through the slide deck with regard to these principles is the alignment with applicable policies, the symmetrical treatment of cost benefits, the issue around accounting for relevant impacts. I know here also avoiding double counting, especially in some cases where there might be some double counting across different environmental impacts, compliance impacts versus societal impacts, health impacts versus environmental impacts. There are areas across NEIs to ensure there is not double counting. And lastly, I also mention separating benefit cost analysis from rate impact analysis. This is a principle that is especially relevant when we start thinking about accounting for energy equity, and I'll be touching on that as well. So not going to go through the thick of the details on this slide. And again, Steve gave a flavor of what are the different types of host customer impacts, but it helps to think about the symmetry principle here. And again, alignment with policy. If your jurisdiction has a policy requiring that you account for host customer impacts, what does symmetry look like in your jurisdiction? And on the left here, you have the broad range of host customer impacts, including the costs and different energy impacts, and at the bottom, the non-energy impacts. And to the right, those non-energy impacts are broken down further. The magnitude of these and their relevance can depend on the DER type, and the magnitude can depend on what customer sector or target population that you're looking at. So for example, the magnitude of impacts for certain low or limited income customers might be higher than for other customers. So this is where consideration of the symmetry principle comes in. This is a snapshot, screenshot from our database of screening practices, essentially showing, and this is for efficiency only, how many states account for measure costs for the host customer impacts, and what other NEIs are accounted for. And as you can see, this essentially paints a picture of asymmetry. And this is quite prevalent across states that use a TRC or some modified version of a total resource cost test. And the aim in part of the NSPM is to try to bring recognition that this is an asymmetrical treatment of those NEIs. And for the reasons that Steve stated, important to reach that symmetry one way or another. Some states, however, and increasingly, we're seeing states accounting for a range of host customer non-energy impacts, and in particular using the methodology of a proxy or some percentage adder. And here's a flavor of what some states use. Typically, those adders will include things like increased comfort, sometimes health, safety, and other types of benefits to customers. We do see in some states an explicit health adder for health and safety, as noted here. And a question on methodological approaches generally is where states are using proxies and adders. It's interesting. I'm actually aware of a process underway in Maryland right now as part of the Empower Maryland Energy Efficiency Future Program Working Group, as they're looking to update the Empower Maryland programs. They are in discussion around defining input assumptions for their cost effectiveness test. And the stakeholder process involved in coming up with these adders includes looking at what other states are practicing, what has been their best practice. And there is a sense of, negotiation and discussion across the full range of stakeholders on what's an appropriate and reasonable level, understanding again that these impacts are real, that the value is not zero, and that they should be accounted for at some level. But the process does involve stakeholder discussion, negotiation, and I think also in the context of looking at what other input assumptions are for valuing other impacts as well. Now, a different approach of achieving symmetry is one where I point to New Hampshire. So New Hampshire went through a process a couple years ago where they applied the Nspm framework. They're one of about 6 or 7 states that have or are actively using the Nspm to update their cost effectiveness test. And this graphic here shows that in applying the Nspm and in reviewing the different principles, when into the symmetry principle, they had a TRC test prior to Nspm application. And the stakeholder group, including commission staff, reviewed the consideration of how to deal with participant impacts, where on the left, you'll see the dashed lines under participant impacts as they included the costs, but no benefits. And they deliberated over whether to add benefits to achieve symmetry and to undertake study or use proxies, or alternatively to not include participant impacts at all. And in the end, I think the stakeholder group was fairly split, but in the end, the decision and agreement was made to exclude participant impacts from their test, but to also achieve symmetry and alignment with their policies by adding certain societal impacts and also adding certain utility system impacts to ensure that they accounted for the full range of utility system impacts. This process led to they're developing a primary test unique to their jurisdiction, which they called the Granite state test. And it's a great example of how a state applied the Nspm and how they achieved that symmetry. And it's a unique case of where they didn't end up with the TRC. They really ended up with a test that was unique to the jurisdiction. Unfortunately, while that test was approved by the commission has since denied the 3-year settlement agreement, and it's to be determined where that's going to go. But it's a great example of understanding how to achieve symmetry. Accounting for societal impacts. So again, here are examples of those impacts. And the question is, does a policy articulate whether specific goals, societal goals are a priority for investing in DERs? And if so, they should be accounted for, and even if hard to quantify. And at the bottom here, you can see from the DSP again, states account for certain societal impacts, environmental being one of the highest areas. Yet we know that there are states that have policies increasingly that are looking to account for or that set policy priorities around other societal impacts, whether they be economic development, public health. And yet we're slowly starting to see states take steps to better account for these types of societal impacts in their cost effectiveness. And I'm going to touch on some of these here. So let's talk a little about GHG emission impacts. First thing to think about, and this is a kind of a gray area in some ways, because what we find is that in some states, they account for environmental compliance costs. So where, especially in jurisdictions where there might be a cap and trade system, those GHG emission related compliance costs are accounted for as an avoided cost, a utility avoided costs. They're sometimes embedded in that avoided energy cost and not explicit. but they are accounted for there. Question is are there goals, carbon reduction goals beyond those compliance costs that are identified, whether by statute, whether by utility, and if so, technically, those, if they are anticipated compliance costs, they should be considered an avoided utility impact, or in some cases we see states accounting for that as a societal benefit or an externality. And you can see here where it's considered as part in a primary test versus a secondary test or some sensitivity around that. But the upshot is that we're seeing many states with aggressive goals for reducing carbon emissions. And to that end, we should be accounting for that in our tests. Discount rate matters a lot. And I'll just note here with a picture from an image from the IWG federal study last year showing examples of the social cost of carbon relative to impact rates, discount rates. And I note on the side here as well that Massachusetts, as an example, the utilities have filed their 3-year plans before the commission, and they have proposed a 1% discount rate as opposed to a 2% discount rate used in the past. And the magnitude of change in that dollar per ton social cost of carbon values is very, very profound, significant, and something to think about and consider as a key input factor in the determination of the cost of carbon, and something that we're waiting to see what the federal government will come out with any updates to the IWG recommendations. I believe they are coming supposedly this month or very soon. Health impacts. This is another area where increasingly we're seeing jurisdictions identify public health impacts as a priority and as a goal, a policy goal, improve public health as part of a transition to a clean energy economy in their state. And to that end, EPA developed this benefits per kilowatt hour tool. I hope many of you are familiar with this tool. There's an example here of where Illinois has applied this tool in coming up with these values that they are incorporating in their benefit cost analysis. A note at the bottom here that, the details matter, though, in terms of what emission rates behind models are used and that they can make a difference. And we don't have the time to get into the details, and I'm generally not the technical expert on this either, but it's come up in some discussions whether a marginal short-term versus long-term rate is used in those analyses or an average emission rate, because that makes a difference. And it makes a difference not just in the context, it's important in better understanding, especially as we move to electrification and both in buildings and transportation, what those public health impacts are going to be over the long term. Other societal impacts, economic development. The Nspm recommends that these not be monetized in BCAs, but rather they can be quantified using different methods. We see that there are about 3 jurisdictions across the country that currently account for economic development as part of their BCA, not again always in monetized terms, but quantified and part of the decision-making process. I refer to an ACCC report here that lays out what those different methodologies are and the pros and cons. Resilience, energy security, there may be other goals your jurisdiction has identified, and the question is, how do you quantify societal impacts? If the value is not 0, if it's a priority, is there a qualitative assessment that can be made, as Steve spoke to? This turns to the topic of energy equity. So the different societal impacts we have spoken to, that I've covered thus far. In benefit cost analysis, this is something that E for the Future is looking at very closely in the context of potentially expanding Nspm guidance And we are considering how energy equity fits into benefit cost analysis, which typically looks at system average information, whereas energy equity broadly across the landscape is addressing a number of areas, including changes in procedural practices, planning metrics such as those identified here, community engagement and decision-making and so forth. Importantly, though, at the top here is equity analysis. These are distributional metrics that can be analyzed looking at target populations. And so this is where we're starting to shape recommendations around rate impacts, bill impacts, energy burden, participation rates, and then distributional analysis across a range of goals that we want to see apply to and focus on target populations. So this is just a conceptual piece that's evolving. We're working with others to fully develop this, and more on this later. And I'm going to get the cue here, so I'm going to finish up. Just quickly, the NSPM sets forth and identifies how NEIs can vary, impacts can vary across DRs. They can be a benefit cost or depends on the use case or key factors. And finally, just a heads up that we are working on a new publication that should be coming out next month that provides guidance on quantifying DR impacts for this full range of areas. And we're very excited for this to come out. It covers non-utility system impacts, but also these other key areas. So with that, thank you very much.
Thank you, Julie. That was fascinating. We have a question. Just bear with me. I want to make sure. You referenced the Granite state test as an alternative to the TRC. Would you please define TRC and explain if the Nspm jurisdiction specific tests replace the TRC?
So in the case of New Hampshire, yes, they underwent the process to review their existing test. And I should clarify to everyone that the Nspm and the jurisdiction-specific test and the development of such a test is not a discrete test. The Nspm is a process by which a jurisdiction like New Hampshire looks at their current test, looks at the current impacts they account for, and in reviewing the principles of the Nspm, they determine what modifications should be made to the test. And it's their policies largely that drive what the test is, rather than which is technically what the Nspm refers to as a regulatory perspective, as opposed to a societal perspective or a utility perspective or a total resource perspective, which is the traditional cost test perspectives that are used. So the Granite state test ended up being an outcome of applying Nspm principles and developing a test that was specific to New Hampshire's goals.
Thank you very much, Julie. That was very helpful. Let's turn to Mark, and then we'll hopefully have opportunity for more questions at the end. Mark?
Thank you, Commissioner Frazier. And thank you, everyone, for joining us this afternoon. Looking forward to sharing with you a real-world example of the things that my co-panelists were just talking about. I was part of a working group in the state of Maryland that developed a very detailed benefit cost analysis specifically for electric vehicles. And we put many of the principles regarding non-energy impacts into practice. And what I'm going to do is walk through the outcome of that proceeding and try and give you some real world perspective on how some of these non-energy impacts can play a role in defining the assessments used for these distributed energy resources. So Maryland, like many other states, has set very aggressive electric vehicle adoption goals. As part of that, the utilities in Maryland offer programs to help get charging infrastructure developed. And the commission has ruled that a formal benefit cost analysis is required for those utility proceedings. Related to that, in December of 2020, the Maryland Commission chartered a year-long stakeholder process to gather input from a variety of sources and to work through a consensus building process to define a formal methodology specifically for the benefit cost assessments associated with utility electric vehicle programs. We looked at a lot of different sources, including prior testimony delivered within the state, examples of what other states have been doing. We looked at how Maryland is quantifying their energy efficiency program, and we especially took note of the National Standards Practice Manual that Julie referred to. The working group had 20 to 30 participants throughout the year, and we were able to achieve consensus on a fairly detailed benefit cost methodology framework, which was then considered and unanimously approved by the commission just a couple of weeks ago in January of this year. So that will be the methodology framework for utility filing benefit cost analysis in the state of Maryland moving forward. There is a detailed white paper that describes the outcome of that stakeholder proceeding that will be made available along with the slides for this webinar. And I encourage anyone that's really interested in the details to go through that white paper. It's a fairly readable document that describes why we did the things that we did and sort of what were the actionable details. The building on the discussion from Steve and Julie, electric vehicles are an interesting DER to consider because they're complicated. And in fact, a lot of the reason that states are supporting electric vehicles is because they deliver on those non-energy impacts, things like emissions reductions, for example. And so if we want to support sound decision-making around electric vehicles, we have to account for the energy impacts, because otherwise, what's the point? The whole point of electric vehicles is, in fact, in many cases, those non-energy impacts. So we had to make sure that those were fairly considered, and therefore it's a good example of the kinds of things that my co-panelists were just talking about. Very quickly, here's at a high level some considerations that the working group went through. We ended up defining the methodology at 3 successive levels. There was at a high level, an overall assessment strategy that looked at which assessments were going to be done and why. We then, once we had that strategy, we then went through the tedious process of identifying impacts, either benefits or costs, at a generic level. And then once we had those, we had to go into more detail because particular utility programs can impact the market in each way or in different ways. So translating that generic benefit cost or impact portfolio into a particular utility filing requires that we consider those differences. And so we then took that portfolio of impacts and mapped it into a generic set of potential utility offerings to clarify exactly how they would be handled. As we did that, we needed to make sure that there was fair consideration of impacts that were fairly specific to EVs. EVs create net changes in emissions, which are part of societal impact considerations. And that has a driver on both climate change and public health. So we had to make sure we could quantify both of those. Electrification, vehicle electrification creates profound changes in economics for the vehicle owners. And EVs have the potential to create significant changes in the aggregate load, which impacts the local distribution system, generation, transmission, and so on. EVs are a little bit unusual, however, in that large change in load shape is we have some control over that. We have some influence on when vehicles charge. And to that extent, there's sort of a dispatchable load. So those things are all, very tied to the way electric vehicles are going to impact the electricity markets. And we had to make sure that we accounted for those nuances in the way that we define the tests. We designed this with the recognition that this assessment really informs multiple stakeholder groups. It helps the utilities guide their program design so that they can be proposing programs that are optimal. It quantifies cost effectiveness in a very rigorous way. And then separately, as Julie was just pointing out, it also addresses ratepayer impacts, because in the case of the Maryland program, we wanted to be able to assess both cost effectiveness and specifically how it was going to have an impact on ratepayers. All three of those are of interest to regulators when they're making decisions about these proposed assumptions. And then also, just building slightly on the point that Julie was making right at the end of her presentation, many of these things, once you get beyond sort of the hard generation, distribution, transmission impacts, and you get into things like emissions, that's a lot more complicated. And it gets into things like boundary conditions about, well, when we talk about emissions, how big of a scope do we consider that emissions impact? Is it just local community? Is it at the state? Is it at the national level? Is it the global level? So many of these NEIs bring in very complicated questions about boundary conditions and assumptions about discount rates and so on. And working through those details is key, I found, to really making it feasible to start to bring them into the quantified assessment. So here's what we ended up with. Again, I refer folks to the white paper that I mentioned to get into the details of this. But the consensus within the working group was to create an assessment framework that had 5 different sections. We looked at trying to provide a single test, and there was agreement that that really didn't answer the full scope of questions that that regulators need to wrestle with. It also was confounded by the fact that many of the typical tests have constraints about what benefits or costs are concluded. And so if you just did one strict test, you would end up leaving out some costs or benefits that were really important. So we settled on a multi-part assessment framework that, back to the old adage of creating multiple looks at the elephant. This gives regulators several different perspectives. There's a primary test that's very similar to a societal cost test. It aligns with the Maryland policy goals. Therefore, it's defined as a jurisdiction-specific test. And that test is done just around the scope of the utility program that's being evaluated. There's a secondary closely related test that we call the market-wide test. It's defined in the exact same way as the primary test, except it looks at the market-wide impact for the widespread vehicle electrification that's being targeted in Maryland, not just the impact of the utility programs, but what would happen if those programs were really implemented market-wide. Then there were 2 other tests that focus specifically on ratepayer impacts. They're not classic cost effectiveness tests, but they assess what the impacts are for the ratepayers. The reason there's 2 versions is that one of the tests looks at all impacts on ratepayers, including externalities. So it looks at the impact on the bill, but also impacts on ratepayer health, impacts on climate change, which are certainly felt by ratepayers, and so on. And then we did a more traditional version of that test that looks only at the impacts on a ratepayer's bills. Both these tests are defined just for the non-participating ratepayer, because that's sort of the essential trade-off that regulators are often wrestling with, is that if there's going to be an impact on customers' bills as a result of a particular utility investment, how does that impact the non-participating ratepayers? In this case, all the folks that don't have EVs. There's a 5th category that includes other strategic considerations, things that are relevant to the regulatory decision-making, but which don't necessarily fit into some of these tests, or which are not necessarily easy to quantify. So I won't go through these in detail. Again, they're detailed in detail in the white paper that I mentioned. But this is, in essence, the second level that I mentioned, where we mapped all the different impacts across the different tests, and we identified whether they were a cost or a benefit, or whether they increase or potentially decrease ratepayer impacts. You can see it's broken out as the Nspm describes into utility and power sector impacts, impacts on participants, and impacts on societal costs and benefits. Many of these, or at least several of these, are what would be called non-energy impacts, things like changes in emissions for climate change and public health and so on. That second level of benefits was then mapped into generic versions of utility programs that need to be considered, because as I mentioned, each of these programs impacts the market in different ways, and you need to account for that in making the determination about whether they're a cost or a benefit, or whether they increase or decrease ratepayer impacts. So this is that third level of decision making that I described. It maps that same portfolio of impacts in more detail into each of the individual generic utility program offerings and clarifies how they would be counted as a cost or a benefit, or not applicable in some cases. And that's done both for the society tests and for the non-participating ratepayer impact tests. So just a couple of quick comments about how NEIs played a role in this process. As I mentioned at the beginning, in my view, and I think a lot of the stakeholders would agree with this from this process, these NEIs were really critical to fairly representing electric vehicle benefit cost outcomes, because in fact, it was those non-energy impacts that were the whole reason Maryland was supporting vehicle electrification to begin with. So had we not been able to include them clearly and fairly, we would have been, guiding policy decisions without in fact considering the whole motivation for the programs in the first place. We did some things in the framework to make sure that the NEIs were represented. The fact that the jurisdiction-specific test was fairly closely defined to match a classic societal cost text brings in some of those externalities. We did the market-wide test, which makes it easier to see how some of these NEIs show up when you start talking about larger scale programs, not just the small scale programs that are currently being proposed in some cases. And then we took the fairly innovative step of looking at a ratepayer impact, but recognizing that externalities impact ratepayers as well. It's not just about the cost on the bill. It's also about all of the impacts on ratepayers, including their health and so on. We did look at how electric vehicles impact load shapes. We looked at things like RPS compliance costs, the emissions reductions as I described, and the changes in participant economics, namely, if you own an electric vehicle and you're charging with electricity rather than gasoline, how does that change your total cost of ownership? And it turns out, by the way, that along the lines Steve was suggesting, that's actually one of the biggest numbers in the whole model. It actually swamps a lot of the other impacts in the calculation. We did note in the white paper that there were some other NEIs that were considered, but we didn't include them in the framework, mostly because they were either negligible in the case of electric vehicles, or we didn't have a well-vetted, trusted way of quantifying those. And I listed some of those here. There were some others possible you heard Julie and Steve talk about, but which were not part of the stakeholder discussion, but which are really important. And again, we didn't include them mostly because we just don't have good mechanisms yet for quantifying them in a trusted way. So my goal here was to walk through a real world example of how these NEIs can really make a difference in putting together an assessment framework on as complicated a subject as electric vehicles. I hope this was helpful for folks. If people have questions or would like to get more information about this, I encourage you to reach out. My email address is here. And in closing, I just did want to acknowledge that I had the privilege of representing the work of an entire stakeholder group that was active for a full year that included a lot of different folks involved in the state of Maryland. So I did want to acknowledge the work of all of them, including the joint utilities that participated in that. So with it, let me stop there and turn it back to the commissioner to see if there are any questions.
Thank you, Mark. That was a very informative real world example. We do have a question from the audience. Does the framework consider the rate impacts of EVs or only the bill impacts? If it doesn't consider rate impacts, why are they excluded?
It does include rate impacts. So one of the tests within that framework does look at the impact of ratepayers, and as part of that, it looks specifically at the impacts on rates and then the impact on customers' bills.
Fantastic. You mentioned the stakeholder process in your closing. It seems as if the process was very successful. Can you tell us a bit more about the stakeholders who were involved and whether they had participated in something like that before?
Yeah, that's a great question. And to be honest, I think the experience that we had on this in Maryland was a really good example of how it could work. It was a very diverse group of stakeholders. We had representation from commission staff, Office of People's Counsel, representation from several other state agencies that are actively involved. We had representation from industry, especially the vehicle charging industry. We had significant involvement from subject matter experts, people like Julie and Stephen and other folks that are involved in the National Standardized Practice Manual work and so on. And then a variety of consultants like myself that are busy actually doing this work in the real world for a variety of clients that has experience a lot from across a lot of other jurisdictions. And then I especially want to mention all 5 of the utilities were actively involved in the process as well. So I think, first of all, the first key to success was a really strong and diverse group of stakeholders. And believe it or not, we had 20 to 30 people involved on every call for a full year. So this was a pretty intensive process. I think the second key to success was we went through a very iterative process. We kind of got into this mode of just we did draft 1 and we got comments, and then we did draft 2 and then we got comments and so on. And by the time we got through draft, I think 6 or 7, by the time we were done, it had changed dramatically from the initial proposals in response to all that feedback. And then I would say that the third key to success was that there was a lot of very active participation, including by myself and some of the other subject matter experts. But I think although we all had views, everybody was trying to get to a common goal. So I did see a lot of compromise. And there were several things in that framework, for example, where some of the stakeholders were like, I really don't care about that. And if it was up to me, I don't really think that's important and I wouldn't include it, but I can live with including it if it's important to other people. And I think the fact that we got to that sort of discussion at several crucial points throughout the year. And to be honest, the trade-off is we ended up with a 5-part framework that's more complicated. But that was the mechanism for sort of addressing the diverse set of interests and needs that people all around the table were interested in. So I thought it was a really good example. It was kind of complicated though.
Thank you for sharing that. Our panelists have been answering questions in the Q&A and the chat. I don't know, Danielle, if we have time for one more. Julie, do you know what models PUCs and energy efficiency program administrators are using to determine the avoided costs of energy efficiency associated with reductions in carbon emissions? It'll have to be a lightning answer.
Yeah, I actually responded in the chat, and I'm sorry, I must have sent it directly to the person inquiring. That was Lisa Schwartz. So I wasn't sure whether she was asking about models such as AVERT, and she actually made a statement that regarding use of a model coming out of the Northwest Power Conservation Council as something that that the industry should be looking at. So I don't know that if she can speak to that at all, but something maybe that she can share in the chat with everyone else. I'm not aware of that model.
you very much, Julie. Unfortunately, we are out of time. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. Thank you for the panel. Thank you to the panelists and to Danielle and Jessica from NARUC. And I'll turn it over to Danielle.
And thank you so much, Commissioner Frazier. Yes, thank you so much to our panelists for your robust presentations and answering all of the questions that we received in writing. That was very generous of you to be so attentive. We just wanted to flag for folks that we will have another monthly innovation webinar on black start considerations in a highly renewable supply future on February 24th at the same time, 3 o'clock. And as I put in the chat multiple times, the presentation slides for today are posted and the recording will be there shortly. That's the same place to go for signing up for the next webinar. And thank you again, everyone. Have a great day.
Thank you.